The tunnel had no name. It stretched before me, an unlit maw carved into the hillside, swallowing the last traces of the fading sun. The air around it was thicker than the outside world, pressing against my skin as if the tunnel itself exhaled some unseen weight. A rusted sign leaned at an angle near the entrance, its letters worn away by time. If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. The path leading in was uneven, slick with damp stone and lined with weeds that curled inward, as though afraid to grow too close. I don't remember why I entered. I only recall the sensation of inevitability, as though I had done this before, as though my feet already knew the path. The moment I stepped inside, sound dissolved into silence. My own breath felt muted, as if the tunnel swallowed not just light, but all things that made the world familiar. The walls curved inward, narrowing just enough to feel suffocating, though I could still move forward with ease. With each step, the air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rain hitting rusted metal. I kept walking. Time did not seem to exist in the tunnel. I glanced at my watch out of habit, only to see the hands frozen at 3 o'clock. Had I been walking for minutes, hours, my footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound always arriving a fraction of a second late, as if something behind me mimicked my movements. The further I went, the more distant the entrance became, until it was swallowed completely by the dark. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the tunnel's blackness, illuminating slick walls that pulsed with moisture. And then, without warning, the ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't a stumble, nor a drop. It was a feeling of being unmade and rebuilt in the span of a breath. The walls remained the same, the damp air unchanged, but something was different. The tunnel behind me was gone. I turned, expecting to see the faint outline of the entrance, but there was nothing. Just the tunnel, stretching endlessly in both directions. My breath caught. Had I made a wrong turn? But that was impossible. I had walked straight. I knew I had. I turned forward again, trying to steady myself, trying to shake off the disquiet seeping into my bones. And then I saw it. Ahead of me, just barely visible in the dim glow of my light, was a figure. They stood motionless in the center of the tunnel, facing away. Their posture was eerily familiar, the way their shoulders curved slightly inward, the way their breath misted in the cold air. A warning surged through me, primal, urgent, but before I could react, the figure turned, and I saw my own face staring back at me. I didn't scream. The sound caught in my throat, strangled by disbelief. My own face stared back at me from the darkness, its expression unreadable, eyes hollowed by the dim glow of my flashlight. It wasn't a reflection, there was no mirror, no glass between us. This thing, this other me, was solid. Real. It stood with the same uneasy posture I had, shoulders hunched slightly inward, as if the weight of recognition pressed down on both of us at once. Then it moved, a fraction of a step forward. The motion was sluggish, like something struggling to wake up from a deep sleep. I took an instinctive step back, my heels scraping against the damp stone floor. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. My pulse hammered in my ears, sinking with the tunnel's unnatural silence. I should have spoken. I should have demanded answers. But what do you say to yourself when you are the one who does not belong? The other me blinked, slow and deliberate, before raising one hand in a motion that felt rehearsed. Fingers twitched slightly, then curled into a loose fist. A gesture I recognized not from memory, but from something deeper. A reflex, a habit. My stomach twisted. I had done this before. This exact moment had already happened, and I had already failed to change it. Then the figure opened its mouth, and though no sound escaped, I understood. My own lips formed the words an instant later, unbidden, unconscious. Go back." The tunnel shuddered. The walls pulsed, stones seeming to shift like living flesh. A sharp pressure filled my skull, like something unseen pressing against the inside of my head. The figure's expression twisted not anger, not fear, but something worse, recognition. I turned and ran. The tunnel stretched impossibly long ahead of me, the air growing heavier with each step. My breath rasped, echoing back at me in uneven gasps. Behind me, footsteps followed mine, but not mine. I knew without looking that the other me had started moving. I knew that it would reach me, and that I would not be fast enough. But then something shifted. The tunnel brightened. Just slightly, a sliver of dim light ahead. The exit. It hadn't been there before. I forced my legs to move faster, pushing against the thick, unyielding air. My chest ached, my limbs burned, but I reached for the light, desperate, and then I was standing at the entrance again. The outside world stretched before me, untouched. The sun had not moved. The rusted sign still leaned at its angle, frozen in time. The wind carried the same cool breath of evening, as if only a second had passed. But I knew the truth. I knew something had changed. I turned back to the tunnel, heart still hammering. The entrance gaped, black and silent, waiting. And just before I could step away, just before I could decide whether to flee or to return, a shadow shifted deep within. Something was still inside, and it was watching. I stood at the tunnel's entrance, gasping for breath. My legs trembled, my mind reeled. The world outside was unchanged, no proof that I had stepped into something unnatural, nothing to confirm what I had seen. But my body knew. My skin prickled with lingering cold, and my pulse thudded with the echo of footsteps that were not mine. I should have left. I should have turned and walked away, let the tunnel keep its secrets, but something held me there, something more powerful than fear. The feeling of wrongness clung to me like damp air. I could still see that figure, my own face, staring from the dark. And I could still hear the words, silent yet deafening, "Go back." The problem was, I had gone back. I had returned to the beginning. But I wasn't the same as before. I took a slow step forward. The tunnel loomed, its gaping mouth swallowing the last light of day. The rusted sign near the entrance, illegible before, now bore faint traces of letters. I leaned in, breath catching in my throat. The metal was worn and corroded, but I could make out a few words. "Turn around, don't go further." The last line was nearly erased. But as I traced it with my fingers, the letters burned into my mind. Like an afterimage, "You've been here before." The wind shifted. I froze. Somewhere inside the tunnel, something moved. A whisper of sound, so soft I almost mistook it for the wind sighing through the trees. But wind did not breathe. Wind did not watch. I stepped back. The sensible part of me screamed to leave, to abandon this place. But then, something flickered in the darkness, a light. It was dim, barely more than a glow. Not white, not warm, but pale blue, wavering like a candle's flame caught in an unseen draft. It pulsed once, twice, then disappeared. My breath hitched, a signal, a warning, or something calling me forward. I swallowed hard, one more step, that's all it took. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the weight of the tunnel settled over me again, thick and suffocating. The air was colder, damp with something that smelled like earth and time. The ground beneath my feet shifted, just slightly, just enough to remind me that nothing in this place was stable. And then a voice, not an echo, not a trick of my mind, a real whispered voice, curling through the dark, reaching for me like unseen fingers. "You are late." My stomach dropped, the air pressed tighter, the silence waiting for my response, but I had none. I didn't know what I was late for. I didn't know who had spoken, but I did know one thing: I wasn't alone. I didn't move. The voice had come from somewhere deep inside the tunnel, from the same direction as that flickering blue light. The words lingered in the air, soft but certain. "You are late." For what? The silence stretched, thick and expectant. The damp air curled around my skin, sending a slow chill down my spine. My breath came shallow, uneven. Every instinct told me to turn around, to step back into the world where time flowed forward, where reality wasn't shifting beneath my feet. But I had already crossed the threshold, and something in me whispered that if I turned back now, I would never leave this place. I swallowed hard and forced my feet forward. The tunnel walls seemed closer now, the ceiling lower. My own breath echoed strangely, distorted like sound bouncing off water. The smell of damp stone thickened, laced with something metallic. I passed the spot where I had first seen myself, the other me. Nothing stood there now, but the air still felt occupied, like an invisible presence waited just beyond my reach, watching, measuring. Then I saw it, further down the tunnel, that pale blue glow returned. This time it didn't flicker. It held steady, waiting. I moved toward it cautiously, heart hammering. The light revealed more details as I neared. The jagged edges of the tunnel walls, the damp streaks running down the stone like veins, the uneven ground where shadows pooled. And then I saw the chair. It sat in the center of the tunnel, old and wooden, its surface worn smooth. The blue glow hovered just above it, shifting slightly, as if moved by an unseen current. A chair, deep inside a tunnel where no one should have been. The wrongness of it made my skin prickle. I took another slow step, my foot pressing against something brittle. I looked down. Scattered at the base of the chair were pages, crumpled, torn at the edges, some half, buried in the dirt, some resting on the seat itself. I bent down, my fingers brushing the nearest one. The ink was smudged, but I could still make out words, scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting. "You are late." I swallowed hard. Another page, this one barely legible. "Don't sit, don't wait, keep moving." I glanced at the chair again, my breath catching in my throat. The seat was dusty, untouched, but something about it felt wrong, familiar, like I had seen it before, like I had been here before. And then a shadow moved behind me. I turned sharply, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there, but I knew better now. The air was too heavy, the silence too watchful. I was being followed. Not by something, by myself. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. The air had changed thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. The tunnel behind me stretched into blackness, and though I saw nothing, I knew I was not alone. I turned back to the chair. The blue glow had dimmed, as if whatever force held it, there was losing interest. The pages scattered at its base whispered against the dirt, shifting slightly, though no wind moved through this place. I crouched, hesitating before picking up another page. My fingers brushed the surface, paper soft and fragile with age. The ink, though smeared, formed a message that sent a slow, cold pulse through my veins. You left, but it brought you back. A deep unease settled in my chest. I reached for another page, half buried in the dirt. This one was torn down the middle, but I could still read the words, "Do not sit, do not speak to it." I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how quiet the tunnel had become. My own breath sounded too loud, my pulse drumming in my ears. Then a sound, soft, barely there, a scrape, like something shifting against stone. It came from behind the chair. My flashlight beam wavered as I lifted it, sweeping the tunnel ahead. The blue glow flickered again, as if warning me to move, to run. But I couldn't. My body had locked into place, my instincts warring against my curiosity. Another sound, closer, a rustling like fabric dragging along the ground. Then a whisper, "You are late." A sharp chill stabbed through me. The voice was low, almost disappointed. Not a question, a statement. The chair creaked. I took a step back. My heel hit something, another page. My pulse pounded. I forced my gaze downward. This one was written differently, neater, calmer, almost as if the writer had more time. "If you listen, it will take you further back." A soft breath of air ghosted across my neck. I ran. The tunnel blurred around me, walls narrowing, darkness pressing in. My own footsteps pounded against the stone, but I swore I could hear another set just behind me, perfectly in sync. The blue glow flickered again, farther ahead this time, pulling me forward, and then I stumbled. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and suddenly, the tunnel was different. The air warmer, the walls smoother. I turned, gasping for breath. The chair was gone. So were the pages. But ahead of me, deeper in the tunnel, something else waited. Something I had seen before. Something that should not have been there. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier, like stepping into a room that had been sealed for centuries. The tunnel was no longer the same. The damp stone walls were smoother, polished in a way that made them feel unnatural. The scent of wet earth had faded, replaced by something sterile and artificial, like a hospital hallway left abandoned. I turned slowly, my breath unsteady. The chair was gone, the pages were gone, but the sense of being watched had only deepened. Ahead, the tunnel stretched into quiet darkness, but something was different. A faint hum vibrated through the floor, too steady to be natural. It pulsed beneath my feet, a rhythm I couldn't place, like a machine running somewhere deep within the earth. I stepped forward, my own footfalls swallowed by the strange silence. The flashlight beam wavered as I moved, sweeping over walls that should have been rough with time, but were now eerily smooth. No cracks, no dirt, just endless, curved stone, bending toward something unseen. Then a door. It stood in the tunnel's path, embedded in the stone like it had always been there. Unlike the rough cavern walls I had seen before, this door was metal, large and featureless, except for one thing, a clock, set directly in its center. The hands didn't move, they were frozen at 3 o'clock. My stomach twisted. The memory of the pages returned to me. It always happens at 3 o'clock. I took a slow step closer, my fingers trembling as I reached out. The metal felt cold, unnaturally so, like touching something that had never known warmth. Then a soft click. The hands of the clock ticked backward, not forward, backward. 3 minutes to 3. 2 minutes to 3. 1 minute to 3. My pulse pounded as I stepped back, my mind racing. This was wrong. This was the door opened. A rush of air pulled at me, and before I could resist, I fell forward, stumbling through. And suddenly, I was somewhere else. The tunnel was gone. The metal door was gone. Instead, I was standing on a street. A familiar street, my street, but something was wrong. The air was too still, the sky too dim, as if the world had been placed under a dying light. The houses stood where they always had, but their windows were dark, their doors shut tight. I turned, heart racing. The tunnel entrance was behind me, except it wasn't. There was only an empty lot, like the tunnel had never existed at all. I swallowed hard, my breath unsteady. My house was just ahead, the front door slightly ajar, waiting. I had been here before. The door to my house was open just enough to see inside. Nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. My chest tightened. I had stood here before. I knew I had, but something was different. The air smelled faintly of smoke, as if a candle had just been blown out, and the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. I stepped forward, placing my hand against the door. The wood was warm, almost unnervingly so, as if someone had just touched it from the other side. My breath caught as I pushed it open. The interior was wrong. It was my house, but the details were shifted. The furniture had been rearranged not in a chaotic way, but with purpose, as if someone had tried to recreate my home from a faulty memory. The hallway rug was there, but instead of the deep red pattern I remembered, it was a dull, muted gray. The clock on the wall still ticked, but it no longer displayed the correct time. It was ticking backward. I took another step inside. My footsteps made no sound on the floorboards. A thin layer of dust covered the surfaces, untouched, except for the table in the center of the room. A single object rested there, a page. I swallowed hard and moved closer. The handwriting was mine. I recognized the way the letters slanted slightly to the right, the pressure of the pen heavier on certain strokes. But I had never written this before. You are home, but you have never been here before. A shiver ran down my spine. I reached for the paper, hesitating only a moment before lifting it. Underneath, the surface of the table was scratched not with random marks, but with words carved deep into the wood. "It will find you here." A soft creak echoed from upstairs. My breath hitched. Someone was moving. No, not moving. Waiting. The same feeling from the tunnel settled over me. That crushing sensation of unseen eyes watching, pressing, waiting for me to make the next move. The clock ticked backward. The air grew thicker. Another step overhead. I wasn't alone, but I had been here before. Hadn't I? The noise from upstairs came again. A soft, deliberate step. My heart quickened. The house, my house, felt more like a cage than a home now. Every inch of it was wrong, from the misplaced furniture to the flickering clock on the wall, its hands moving steadily backward, as if mocking me. I could almost hear it counting down, one tick at a time, towards something I wasn't sure I could escape. I took a breath, forcing myself to move. The hallway stretched out in front of me, too familiar and yet too foreign, as if it had been pulled from a dream. My feet felt heavy on the worn wood floors, the air stifling with the scent of something that couldn't quite place. Dust, yes, but more than that. A lingering metallic sharpness, like blood had soaked into the walls long ago. I climbed the stairs slowly, the staircase creaking beneath my weight. Every step echoed too loudly, too perfectly, as if the sound had been waiting to be triggered. My pulse thrummed in my ears, and yet the silence of the house pressed in, suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The second-floor hallway was dim, lit only by the fading light outside the window, but there was something there, a shadow that didn't belong. It didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me, pulling my attention toward the door at the end of the hall. The door to my room. I didn't want to go there, but something inside me, a force I couldn't control, compelled me to walk toward it. My legs moved of their own accord, each step growing heavier than the last, as though the air thickened around me with every passing second. I reached the door. The handle was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, but as my fingers curled around it, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, just like the front door had been. A faint, low hum emanated from the other side, not loud, but persistent. It was a rhythm, familiar yet offbeat, like the thrum of machinery deep underground, too steady, too constant. I hesitated for a moment, but then the hum grew louder, and something deep inside me whispered that I had no choice. I had to go inside. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, but not completely. The glow from outside the window pooled across the floor, illuminating the shape on the bed. My eyes darted to it, and my breath caught in my throat. It was me, lying on the bed, still as stone. The other me. I blinked, my heart slamming in my chest. But when I looked again, the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. A sudden clatter made me jump. The clock on the wall had stopped. 3 o'clock, and then the sound came again, louder this time, footsteps from behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place. The footsteps from behind me were slow, deliberate, each one heavier than the last, as if the person-thing was dragging their feet, enjoying the suspense. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the coldness creeping over my skin, settling deep in my bones. The room, now bathed in an eerie, dim light, felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with a presence I couldn't quite identify. It was as if the house itself had shifted, pulling me deeper into its grip, its hold tightening around me with each passing second. The footsteps continued. They came closer, the sound unmistakable, right behind me now. My legs refused to move. I couldn't bring myself to turn, to look, to confirm what was already suffocating my senses. Whispering, low, indistinct murmurs, as if voices were weaving in and out of my mind. It wasn't words at first, just a jumble of sounds, fragments of sentences, too faint to understand, too close to ignore. They came from every direction, from all corners of the room, from within the walls themselves. I took a slow, shallow breath, gathering the last of my will. The door behind me, the way I had come in, was still ajar. but it felt so far, like I would never reach it. The hallway outside, though familiar, seemed to stretch on, longer than it had been. The distance between me and the door grew, pulling me back into the center of the room. Then a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a low, guttural tone. "It is always 3 o'clock here." I turned, the words pulling me like a string. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was shrouded in darkness, its shape blurry, indistinct, like a shadow that had taken form but didn't belong. Its presence radiated coldness, something so deep that it chilled the air around me. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone seemed to fill the room, its weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. My voice was lost in the stillness. Then, the room seemed to shift again, like a wave rolling over the surface of water, pulling me back to the bed, back to that strange, cold place where I had seen myself earlier. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't think about it. "You never left." The figure whispered, "You're always here." A pulse of cold air swept through the room. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening. I felt my feet move, dragging me toward the doorway. My body was no longer my own. I couldn't stop it. I stepped into the hall, and the house felt even more alive, each creak, each whisper more present than before. But the figure, whatever it was, remained behind me. The clock on the wall ticked backward, and my mind reeled. The house was changing, and I was trapped. The hallway stretched before me, longer than it should have been. The walls, once familiar, now felt foreign, pressing in on me, as if the house were reshaping itself, folding the space around me. The air was thick with that same strange cold, and each step I took echoed far too loudly, too clearly, as if every sound I made were being recorded for some unseen audience. The figure from the doorway, the one I had felt rather than seen, was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, like an oppressive fog that refused to lift. I could feel it, its weight, its eyes, watching my every move. I forced my feet to move, pulling myself toward the stairs at the end of the hall. My pulse throbbed in my ears, the beat steady and relentless, and the clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder now, its backward march an incessant reminder of the time slipping away. 3 o'clock, always 3 o'clock. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated, the railing beneath my hand feeling unnaturally cold, too smooth, too perfect. It wasn't how it should be. I could remember it, rough, splintered, worn by years of use, but now it was pristine, as though it had never been touched by time. I looked up. The shadows at the top of the stairs were thick, almost liquid, as if they were crawling down the walls toward me. The light above was dim, flickering, but I could swear it was moving, shifting with an intelligence of its own. The house was warping, twisting around me. I had to get out. I had to leave, but no matter where I turned, it felt like the house was pulling me back. I had tried to leave before. I had stood at the door, but I never truly left. The tunnel had shown me that. The pages, the clock, the darkness behind the walls. I wasn't meant to leave. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the hallway, as if the house itself had exhaled, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the change settle deep in my chest, as if the very air were closing in around me. A low hum filled the space now, vibrating through the floor, reverberating in my bones. It was the same hum I had felt in the tunnel, the same rhythmic pulse that I couldn't escape. It was as though the house had a heartbeat, and it was beating in time with my own. I turned toward the stairs again, my heart racing. The figure hadn't followed me, but I felt its presence, still hovering just out of sight. The room at the top of the stairs, the one I had tried to avoid, was waiting. I knew what was there, but I had to go anyway. My legs moved before I could think, taking me up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It was a living thing, and it wasn't going to let me go. The upstairs landing felt different than it should have. The very air seemed thicker, colder, and yet somehow suffocating. As I stepped off the stairs, I felt the strange weight of something pressing against my chest, as if the house itself were forcing the air out of me, making it harder to breathe. Every part of me was on edge, a deep sense of wrongness pooling in the pit of my stomach. The hallway stretched out before me, the walls narrowing as if closing in, trapping me between them. The same soft hum from earlier filled the space, low and constant, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. It was as if the house was alive, breathing with me, or perhaps even breathing me in. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners, curling like tendrils, reaching out to grab hold of me. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me. No, something was waiting. I could feel it in the way the temperature shifted, in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. But when I turned, I saw nothing but empty space. There were no figures in the hallway, no movement in the darkened doorways that lined either side. Still, the unease lingered, thick and oppressive. I turned toward the far end of the hall, where the door to my room stood. It hadn't changed, but I wasn't sure anymore if I wanted to go inside. I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to go inside again. Yet, something in the back of my mind whispered that the answer lay beyond that door. I approached slowly, my feet dragging with each step, as if the house were trying to slow me down, make me think twice. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. The house had already made its choice. I was going to face whatever lay beyond that door, no matter how deep the dread clawed at my throat. My hand reached for the doorknob, but just as my fingers brushed against the cool metal, a sound, a low, distorted whisper, seeped from beneath the door. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt familiar, like a long, forgotten memory stirring in the back of my mind. The whisper grew louder, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were fragmented, distorted by some unseen force. "Not yet," it breathed, "not yet. You haven't finished." A shiver ran through me, the words wrapping around me like a cold fog. I took a step back, suddenly unsure, but the door creaked open of its own accord, and there it was. The room, my room, but it was wrong. The walls were warped, the furniture twisted, as though time itself had bent around them, distorting everything in its wake. The window was cracked open, but no light came through, just a deep, suffocating darkness, and in the center of the room, standing motionless, was the figure. The same one. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was moving toward me. The figure moved closer, its form still indistinct, like a shadow that was desperately trying to be seen. It was too tall, almost too long, with arms that stretched unnaturally, swaying with the subtle rhythm of its movement. The darkness around it seemed to melt and shift, warping in its presence. I froze, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so loud that it threatened to drown out the sound of my breath. My legs refused to obey, my body rebelling against the instinct to flee. The figure's head tilted slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw something in its eyes, a glimmer of recognition, or perhaps it was just the shadow of my own fear reflected back at me. It was close now, too close. I could feel the air grow heavier, colder, as if the very temperature of the room had dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. But it wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, pressing in on me like an invisible weight, crushing my chest with each shallow breath. The room had grown impossibly still. The hum that had filled the house was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that stretched, pulled, and throbbed within the walls themselves. The figure stood just a few feet away, and it was still, but I could feel its presence, as if it were pulling on the very fabric of time. I glanced down at the floor, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A doorway. But no, it wasn't a doorway at all. The walls had begun to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. The air seemed to shift again, and suddenly, the ground beneath my feet moved, pulling me into the room, drawing me closer to the center. The figure didn't need to reach out. It didn't need to touch me. The house itself was dragging me toward it. The walls closed in, the room seeming to shrink with each passing moment, warping and twisting around me. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came from my lips. The house was muting me. I closed my eyes, hoping that if I couldn't see the figure, I wouldn't feel its presence so keenly. But when I opened them again, the room had changed. The walls were gone, replaced with endless shadows that stretched toward an infinite horizon. There was no ceiling, no floor, just the darkness, suffocating and thick. And then I understood. I was no longer in the house. I was somewhere else, somewhere timeless, somewhere I couldn't escape. I reached out, hoping to touch something, anything, but my fingers brushed only air. There was no solid surface. The figure had vanished, but the overwhelming sense of being watched remained, pressing against me from every side. The shadows grew deeper, closer, and in their depths, I saw flickers of shapes, distorted images, echoes of places I recognized, places I had been before. It was the house again, but it wasn't. It was stuck in time, and I was stuck with it. I looked at the walls, where cracks had started to form, spreading like veins, but no matter where I turned, the cracks always seemed to be just ahead of me, always waiting to widen. The tunnel was still there, beneath everything, just out of reach, but always close enough to feel. I was trapped in the loop. The darkness around me was now so thick it felt as though I were floating in it, suspended, drifting aimlessly through a void where nothing seemed real. The air was unnaturally still, the silence suffocating, but there was an odd sense of serenity in the stillness. I should have been terrified, frantic, but instead, there was only a heavy resignation, as if I had been here before, or perhaps I was meant to be here. The cracks in the walls stretched further, winding and twisting, always just ahead of me, always leading deeper into the unknown. I could feel the pulse of something far beneath, a slow rhythm that mirrored my heartbeat, a beat that resonated with every part of my being. The shadows were growing thicker, bleeding into the air like ink in water. They seemed to move, stretching and shifting in unnatural ways, as though they were alive. The figure, the one I had seen before, was still absent, but its presence hung heavy in the air. I could feel it, an almost tangible weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me, as if it were waiting for something. I reached out into the darkness, my fingers grazing the cool surface of what seemed to be another wall. But when I pressed harder, it felt like the wall was shifting beneath my hand. I recoiled, instinctively pulling away, but the sensation lingered. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to be alive, constantly moving, evolving, as though it had a mind of its own. It was changing around me, but there was no rhyme or reason to it. I thought I saw something, a flash of light, a door, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I blinked, unsure if it had ever been there at all. It was like a memory trying to escape me, just out of reach. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of my next move. The air felt heavy with expectation, as if the house, if this could even still be called a house, was waiting for me to make a decision. But what choice did I have? I could go forward, or I could go back, but either way, the same oppressive presence was following me, like a shadow that refused to leave. The walls began to pulse, slowly at first, then faster, the rhythm matching my quickening heartbeat. I could feel the pressure in the air, thickening, as though I were being drawn in, sucked into the very fabric of this strange world. Every movement I made seemed to shift the atmosphere, sending ripples through the air, but there was no escape. It was like being trapped in the middle of a clock, its gears spinning around me, pulling me in one direction, then another, with no way to stop it. The clock was broken, stuck on the same time, the same moment, the same never-ending loop. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath, trying to regain control of myself. But when I opened them again, the shadows had taken a new shape. They were moving toward me, circling, closing in, but this time they didn't feel like the same shadow that had followed me earlier. No, this was something else. It was as if the very darkness had become aware of me. I could feel it swirling around me, touching my skin, crawling beneath it, 1,000 unseen hands brushing against me. I wanted to scream, to run, but the air had thickened to the point where even my thoughts felt sluggish, distant. I was no longer sure what was real. Was it the house, the tunnel, or was I simply a part of it now? A thread lost in a vast, endless web. I blinked, the oppressive darkness pressing in on my senses, and when I opened my eyes, I was no longer standing in the ever-changing room. The walls were gone, replaced by something even more unnerving. I was now on a narrow pathway, stretching endlessly before me, a faint glow emanating from somewhere in the distance. The path itself was uneven, cracked, as though it had been worn down by time, or something far older than time itself. The glow ahead was dim but constant, and as I stepped forward, I noticed the ground beneath me wasn't solid at all. It was soft, yielding with each step, as though I were walking on something far more fluid than earth. It was more like thick fog, dense and malleable, shifting with every footfall. The air around me was thick with the smell of decay and wet stone, a scent that clung to my clothes and skin. There was something about the silence now. It was different. It wasn't the heavy stillness of before, the silence that drowned out everything. No, this silence was more like a blanket, settling over me, swallowing up any sound that dared to rise from the depths of my chest. Even my breath seemed muffled, too faint to disturb the heavy air. I continued walking, the path winding and curving beneath my feet. It was as if I were walking in a dream, or perhaps I was no longer walking at all. It felt like I was being drawn forward by an invisible force, a thread pulling me in one direction, inexorably guiding me toward the glow. The glow ahead grew brighter as I approached, its light soft and muted, almost like the dim light of dusk. But it wasn't a natural light. It wasn't the kind of light that belonged to this world. It felt wrong, somehow. Like the sun was setting at the wrong time, at the wrong angle, casting an eerie glow over everything. The path grew narrower, the fog thickening around me. I had to force my feet to move, the air seeming to slow my every motion, dragging me down, slowing my heartbeat, until I felt as though I was moving through syrup. The path curved again, and as I turned, I saw something in the distance. It was another figure, a shape standing still at the end of the path. Tall, slender, and impossibly still. The figure was cloaked in the same shadow that I had felt before, but now it seemed more defined, more solid. The closer I came, the more the figure seemed to grow, looming larger, stretching upward as if reaching for something in the sky. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, my pulse quickening, but something kept me moving forward. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something familiar. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence filled the space, suffusing the air with an undeniable weight. I stopped just a few feet away, the air around me so thick that I could barely breathe. There was something almost inviting about it now, something that beckoned me to draw closer, to look deeper into its void. But I knew better. I had already made the mistake of looking too closely before. The figure before me loomed in the dim glow, its form shrouded in the same unsettling shadow that had followed me for so long. Its presence was oppressive, but it was not the kind of fear that makes you flee. No, this fear held me, anchored me in place, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch. I could feel the path beneath my feet shifting, the fog-like ground warping and tugging at me, as if trying to pull me closer to the figure. There was a gravity to its presence, an invisible force that pressed on me from every side. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, but that wasn't what terrified me. It was the fact that it felt familiar, a reflection of something I had seen, perhaps in a dream or somewhere hidden deep in my memories. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to draw me in, as if it were waiting for me to understand something. The air was thick with a strange, acrid scent, like something old, something ancient. It filled my lungs, making each breath feel like I was inhaling dust, or worse, something far more sinister. I couldn't take a full breath. I could feel the weight of it, suffocating, crawling into my chest. My heart raced as the figure shifted just a slight movement, but it was enough to send a jolt through my body. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, to grow longer and more tangled, as if they were alive, curling and writhing at its feet. And then it began to speak. The words were not audible, not in the traditional sense. They didn't come from its mouth, and yet they filled the space, filling the silence with a whispering hum, like the sound of wind through an ancient forest, or the distant murmur of voices from far below. It was a language I couldn't understand, yet somehow I knew it. The very essence of the words seemed to resonate inside me, shaking loose fragments of memories that weren't my own, as though they were whispers from someone, or something else. I took a step back, my mind reeling, but the shadows didn't allow it. They clung to me, wrapping around my limbs like cold, slippery hands, pulling me closer. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the path itself had become an extension of me, pulling me toward the figure. I was no longer just walking. I was being drawn in. The whispering grew louder, and the world around me began to shift. The ground beneath me trembled slightly, a soft vibration that only added to the unease settling in my chest. The air felt thick, like something was closing in, but there was no escape, no way to go back. I was moving forward whether I wanted to or not. The figure didn't move, but its presence had grown heavier. The shadows had begun to stretch, twisting and curling like something alive, encircling me. There was a deep sense of inevitability, like the moment had already been written, like everything leading up to this point was always meant to be. I wanted to scream, to run, but the darkness swallowed my voice. I had no choice but to take another step forward, to continue down the path that had already been set before me, knowing that whatever lay ahead was no longer a choice. It was fate. The shadows were everywhere now, suffocating, clinging to the edges of my vision like an oppressive fog. The figure remained unmoving, yet its presence seemed to expand, filling every inch of the space around me. The darkness was alive, breathing, whispering with 1,000 voices, none of them clear, all of them distant. They murmured in a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. I stepped forward, my feet heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling at me, unwilling to let me go. Each movement felt more deliberate, more inevitable than the last. There was no turning back, no escape from the ever-tightening grip of the shadows. The path beneath me was shifting, subtly at first, and then with more insistence, as if the ground was no longer certain of its own shape. The air grew thick with an unsettling, unidentifiable scent, something old and rotting, something that shouldn't belong in this place. The whispering continued, the voices growing louder, closer, and for the first time, I thought I heard a single word amidst the static, a name. Mine. I froze, the word echoing through my mind, reverberating in the space around me. It felt like an intrusion, like the shadows had somehow reached inside my thoughts, pulling out fragments of memories long buried. The word, my name, was not spoken in a voice I recognized. It was a voice that belonged to the darkness itself, ancient and timeless, woven into the fabric of this place. Suddenly, the path in front of me split, one direction leading deeper into the shadows, the other toward the faintest glimmer of light. I hesitated, the weight of my choice pressing down on me. The glow in the distance beckoned, but the darkness, too, whispered promises of truths long forgotten, of secrets hidden just out of reach. Both paths felt equally inevitable, like they were the same, looping into one another, never truly leading anywhere new. The whispering seemed to grow in urgency, like a tide pushing against me, pulling at my mind. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath shallow and tight. There was something about the light, something so strangely comforting about it, but the shadows called to me, their tendrils curling around my legs, pulling me toward the other path. A single step forward seemed to break the spell, as though the act of moving had shattered something delicate, releasing a flood of memories, of flashes that weren't mine. I saw fragments of faces, people I didn't recognize, and heard snippets of conversations, all jumbled, lost in the haze. They didn't belong here, and yet they felt as though they were always meant to be part of this place. I turned toward the light, unable to resist. I was no longer walking. I was being pulled. The light flickered and seemed to shift before me, and as I reached out for it, the whispering stopped, silence falling over everything like a thick, impenetrable blanket. The path before me stretched endlessly, and with every step, I felt the world around me begin to fold, warping, distorting as if I were walking through a dream, or perhaps through the fragments of someone else's. There was no longer any difference between the shadows and the light. No clear line between one and the other. It was all the same, all connected in ways I couldn't yet understand. The light flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the path, twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. I stopped, eyes narrowing, heart pounding. There was a strange calm that settled over me, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me to move. But I could feel the change. Something was different now. Something had shifted, and I couldn't quite tell where it had happened or how. The light before me wasn't natural. There was no warmth to it, no welcoming glow. Instead, it cast an eerie, faint radiance, like a distant star trapped in a dark sky, struggling to break free but never quite succeeding. I couldn't tell if it was moving or if I was, but I felt it drawing me in, pulling me toward it with an undeniable force. The shadows, too, seemed to cling to the light, drawn into it like they were part of the same thing, inseparable, just waiting for the moment when they would combine, when everything would become one. I moved closer, not of my own volition, but because I couldn't fight the pull. The ground beneath my feet was still soft, still fluid, and each step I took felt suspended, like I was walking in slow motion, as if time itself had been stretched, pulled out of shape. The air was colder now. The fog had thickened around me, wrapping its damp fingers around my legs, dragging at me with invisible force. Every breath was a struggle, as though the very air was fighting me, as if it didn't want me to be here, didn't want me to continue forward. But the light was so close now, and the whispers had stopped, leaving only the strange, heavy silence. As I stepped closer, the sound of my feet on the soft ground became muffled, as if the world itself had grown quieter, softer. My eyes began to adjust to the dim light, and I realized something. The path before me was not a path at all. It was a mirror, its surface reflecting everything around me but warped, twisted. The walls were distorted, bending like the surface of water, ripples forming in the air, stretching outward as though something was passing through them, something that didn't belong. I reached out, hesitating, but something inside me compelled me to touch it. My fingers grazed the surface of the light, and the moment I did, the world shifted. The air grew colder still, and a sudden sharpness filled my senses. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could feel the sting on my skin, the cold biting into me like icy needles. But there was no frost, no snow, only the unbearable chill. I blinked, trying to adjust, but everything around me had changed again. The walls were no longer walls at all. They had disappeared, leaving me standing in a vast, empty expanse, infinite and stretching in every direction. The light had swallowed everything, and now there was only the echo of my own footsteps and the rhythmic beat of my heart. There was no more path, no more road to follow, only a vast, endless space, and the chilling realization that I was not alone. Something else was here. Something had always been here. The vastness of the space around me was suffocating. No walls, no horizon, just a sea of endless, stretching nothingness, an oppressive blankness that pressed down from all sides. I could feel it, the weight of the absence, the way it suffocated the air, making it harder to breathe with every passing moment. And yet, even in this place, I felt the pull of the shadows, the call of the unknown. I took a step, the sound of my footfall echoing loudly in the silence. the only sound that seemed to exist in this timeless void. The air felt thinner here, colder, as if it was slowly being sucked away, leaving only emptiness behind. Each movement I made was slow, almost hesitant, as though I were walking through treacle, weighed down by an invisible force that grew stronger with every step. In the distance, I saw it again, the flicker of light. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, slow and steady, but far away. I didn't want to follow it. I didn't want to move toward it, but the draw was inescapable. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to stay, to find some sense of stability in this chaotic void, but my feet moved without my command. As I drew closer, I realized that the light was no longer a simple beacon, but something far more complex. It was alive, breathing in its own strange way, shifting and changing with the rhythm of the silence. It warped as I neared, stretching and bending like the reflection in a warped mirror. Only it didn't mirror anything. It was the mirror. The ground beneath me seemed to warp as well, undulating with every step I took, as if the very fabric of reality was bending, folding around me. My heart beat faster, the pulse loud in my ears, as I tried to make sense of it all. The shadows in the distance, too, began to grow darker, longer, and more pronounced, twisting in ways that defied logic, swirling around the light as if trying to consume it, to pull it into the vastness of the void. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the light. It was cool to the touch, but there was something almost electric about it, something that hummed in the air, vibrating against my skin. The moment I touched it, the world seemed to fracture. The edges of reality split, and I felt myself slipping, falling, being pulled into the rift that had opened around me. The sense of being unmoored intensified. I tried to resist, to cling to something solid, but there was nothing. No ground beneath me, no tangible substance to grasp. Everything was shifting, slipping through my fingers, and all I could do was fall. The silence, once so consuming, now felt oppressive, as if it were suffocating me from all sides. I could no longer tell whether I was moving forward or backward, whether I was still within the tunnel or had passed beyond it altogether. It was as if time itself had stopped, and I was left suspended in a place where it no longer mattered. Past and future had become meaningless. Nothing existed here except me, the light, and the ever-encroaching shadows. And then a single thought flashed through my mind, a thought that I could not shake. Had I been here before? The silence stretched on, impossibly thick, suffocating everything within its grasp. It felt like a weight, pressing down on me, crushing me, making every breath an effort. But despite the overwhelming stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. There was something here, something watching, something waiting just beyond my vision. The shadows that had once seemed like a distant presence were now all around me. They clung to the edges of my perception, curling like smoke, reaching out with fingers that were both familiar and strange. I turned in circles, my eyes darting around, trying to spot something, anything, that would break the monotony of this endless void. But there was only the light ahead of me, and the ever-present shadows, twisting and merging with it, pulling it apart in ways I couldn't comprehend. As I moved closer to the light, I noticed something new. The pattern of the shadows had changed. The way they bent and twisted didn't feel random anymore. There was a rhythm to it, a consistency that was almost too deliberate to ignore. The shadows shifted as though they were reacting to me, to my movements, almost as if they were following me, anticipating my every step. I paused. The thought of being watched or followed set a chill through my spine, even colder than the emptiness around me. I couldn't remember how long I had been in this place, couldn't recall how I had gotten here. Time, it seemed, had lost its meaning. It felt like I had been wandering in this endless loop, trapped in some surreal moment, forever shifting between past and future, unable to grasp hold of either. And yet, as I turned again, something strange happened. The shadows seemed to recognize me. They rippled, distorted as though something was trying to form within them. The air around me grew heavier, the pressure mounting, and I realized with a sudden jolt. These shadows weren't random. They were part of a larger pattern, one I hadn't seen before, but one that felt intimately familiar. A memory, or perhaps a feeling, flashed through my mind. I had been here before. I had walked this path, faced these shadows, seen this light. But when, I couldn't remember. It was as if a door to a forgotten part of my mind had cracked open, only to immediately slam shut again. The feeling of déjà vu lingered, a haunting reminder of something I couldn't place. I stepped back, heart racing, but the shadows did not retreat. They followed me, stretching and curling in response to my movements. The light ahead of me seemed to pulse, flickering like a heartbeat, as though it were alive, waiting for me to make my choice. But the choice was no longer clear. Had I already made it? Was this all part of a cycle, a repetition, something that had been playing out since I first stepped into the tunnel? The realization began to settle into me. There was no escape from this place, no end to this journey. The loop had already started, and it would continue until I understood the pattern, until I saw the connections I was blind to. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were memories, fragments of something lost in time, and I was beginning to see their shape. The realization settled heavily on my chest, as if the air itself had thickened with understanding. The shadows weren't simply dark spaces. They were echoes, fragments of something far older than me, older than this place, older than time itself. They had been here before, perhaps in a past I couldn't quite recall, and they would be here again, in a future that seemed both certain and elusive. I felt it then, a sudden shiver that ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the weight of the memory pressing in on me. Something had changed. The air, once stifling and thin, now felt charged, alive with an unseen energy, as if the walls between this place and the world I had left behind were thinning. The flickering light ahead of me pulsed with increasing intensity, casting an almost rhythmic glow that made the shadows writhe in response. I moved closer, drawn by the need to understand. Each step felt like I was walking deeper into a dream, one where the rules were constantly shifting, where nothing was certain except the sensation that I was being pulled towards something I couldn't see, something just beyond my grasp. The tunnel, or whatever this place was, felt more real now, more tangible. The ground beneath me was firm, solid, and yet the air around me seemed to swirl, twisting and curling like an unseen current. The further I went, the more I could feel the presence of the shadows around me. They were closer now, less like distant shapes and more like figures, watching, waiting, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as if they were trapped in this endless cycle with me, caught in a loop that stretched backward in time. I stopped again. The light ahead was brighter now, almost blinding in its intensity, yet it didn't seem to illuminate anything. It only distorted everything it touched. The edges of the shadows blurred and bent, the world around me warping and shifting as if I were staring into the heart of a storm, where the center was calm, but the winds around it howled and twisted. I felt a pull again, but this time it was not toward the light. It was a pull from within, a feeling deep inside me that said I was at the edge of something that had been waiting for me, a memory I couldn't recall, but one that felt undeniably familiar, a place I had been before, even though I hadn't been here in this form, in this time. I turned slowly to face the shadows. This time they did not flicker, they did not retreat, they stayed, pressing in around me like a cloak, closing in from all sides. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was not a place of escape. This was a threshold, a point where time bled together, where past and future overlapped, and where everything I had been running from was about to come face to face with me. The realization stung in my mind like a cruel truth. There was no way out, not anymore, not unless I could understand the pattern. The shadows were waiting for me to remember. The shadows loomed around me now, thick as smoke, dark as forgotten memories. They were no longer passive observers, but active forces, pressing in on me, pushing against my thoughts. They felt familiar, like old friends whose faces I had long forgotten, but whose presence still lingered in my bones. And in their presence, I felt an overwhelming sense of both dread and familiarity, as though I were returning to something I had once known, something I should have never left. I reached out, hesitating just for a moment, before my fingers brushed against the cool, swirling air. It felt like the space itself had depth, layers stacked upon each other, folding in on itself, as if I were standing at the center of a great cosmic illusion. Every step forward seemed to ripple the fabric of this strange reality, sending waves through the very ground beneath me. The tunnel was no longer just a tunnel. It was a living, breathing entity, a place where time didn't merely pass, it folded in on itself, creating loops, intersections, and gaps. Ahead of me, the light flickered again, but this time it didn't pulse with the same rhythm as before. It stuttered, fractured like a dying star, before being absorbed into the shadows, swallowed by the very darkness it had once defied. A sound, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second, filled the air. Whispers, distant and unintelligible, like voices coming from far off in the abyss. Voices that seemed to be calling to me, urging me to listen. I could feel the presence of those voices, not just around me, but inside me, like tendrils of thought winding their way into my mind, pulling me towards some unknown truth. My head throbbed with the pressure of them, and I had to fight to keep my focus. The shadows seemed to pulse in response to my inner turmoil, and the deeper I went into this strange, shifting space, the more the world seemed to warp and stretch beyond recognition. Then, through the chaos of distorted sounds and shifting shapes, I caught something. A glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision. A figure, barely visible in the flickering light, standing still but radiating an unmistakable presence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I might be imagining it. Some trick of the mind, a shadow cast by the flickering light. But the figure did not move. I stepped forward cautiously, each footstep feeling like a journey through thick fog. As I got closer, the figure became clearer, its form solidifying from the shadows. It was tall, its shape indistinct, but there was something undeniably human about it, something about the way it stood, like it was waiting, like it had always been waiting. My heart raced as I finally reached it, and the figure didn't turn to face me, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It simply stood there, its features obscured by the shifting shadows, its outline flickering in and out like a broken image. A sudden coldness swept over me, an unnatural chill that cut to the bone. I stepped back, my gaze never leaving the figure. But as I did, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting for me to follow, to step deeper into the void where it had come from. I wanted to turn and run, to escape this oppressive presence, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. My mind wouldn't let me. I felt as though I had been caught in a trap, a loop that had already begun its cycle. And as I stared into the flickering darkness, I realized that this was the pattern I had been searching for. It wasn't just the shadows that were trapped. I was too. The figure remained still, an immovable presence in the heart of the tunnel, its outline flickering with each pulse of light. Every instinct screamed for me to move, to flee from this thing that had been waiting for me. But my feet felt heavy, cemented to the ground. The tunnel had shifted again, the air growing denser, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in, pushing me toward the figure. I tried to breathe, to steady my heart, but the overwhelming pressure of the place made it impossible. There was something alive about the shadows now, something that made them feel intelligent, as though they were aware of me, of my every thought. I could feel them swirling around me, tugging at the edges of my perception, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. It was a language that didn't require words. It was a language of feeling, of sensation. Every time I thought I understood something, the truth slipped just out of reach. I forced my gaze back to the figure, its presence seeming to anchor me to this reality. It hadn't moved, but there was something about its stillness that was unnerving, like it was more than just a shadow. It was waiting, patiently, for me to acknowledge it. But I couldn't bring myself to do so. Instead, my attention shifted again, drawn to the edges of the tunnel. The shadows were thicker now, as if they were growing, extending outward like a living thing, closing the space between me and the figure. The light ahead had dimmed, flickering weakly, as though it were struggling to maintain its existence. It seemed as though the tunnel itself was waging a silent war, the light fighting against the encroaching darkness. And then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. The shadows that had once clung to it now shifted, crawling across its form, revealing a face hidden beneath the darkness. The sight made my pulse quicken, a rush of panic filling my chest. The face was indistinct, blurred and shifting, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I could make out only fragments, eyes that weren't quite eyes, a mouth that never fully opened, features that were not human, yet still seemed vaguely familiar. I stepped back, my heart pounding, but the figure followed me. It didn't walk. It simply shifted, sliding through the space between us with an unsettling grace. It was as though the laws of movement didn't apply to it, as though it could stretch through time and space at will. The tunnel seemed to contract around me, and with each step I took back, the distance between us closed. The air grew even thicker, and I could feel my mind beginning to strain under the weight of it all. The more I fought against it, the more the shadows tightened their grip. I could feel them tugging at my thoughts, pulling me deeper into their grasp. And then I realized this wasn't just a place, this was a moment. A moment that had already happened, was happening, and would continue to happen, over and over again. The figure was not a being I could run from. It was a part of this loop, a reminder that no matter how far I tried to escape, I would always end up in this same place, facing this same figure, caught in the endless cycle of time. The tunnel was no longer a place, it was a memory I couldn't escape. The realization hit me like a cold wave, pulling me under, suffocating any hope of escape. The figure wasn't just part of the tunnel. It was the tunnel. It was the memory of every loop, every moment that had already passed, and it was the reason I couldn't break free. This was a cycle that had already been written. I was living in a story that had been told before, one that would continue to repeat itself no matter how I tried to change the outcome. The shadows weren't just watching me. They were waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to acknowledge that this was where I belonged. I stood frozen in the center of the tunnel, the walls around me pressing in with increasing pressure. The air had thickened to the point of being solid, like a heavy fog that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. And yet, my mind was clearer than it had ever been, even as the weight of this knowledge threatened to crush me. The tunnel, the shadows, the figure, they were all part of the same thing. They were all pieces of the loop, pulling me back into the same moment, the same place, over and over again. The figure continued to move, its form still a shifting blur, like something that could never quite decide what it wanted to be. But this time, I didn't look away. This time I stared, willing myself to see it clearly, to understand what it was that had been haunting me all along. The figure seemed to grow, its presence expanding with every blink, and for the briefest moment I saw it. The face, it wasn't human. It wasn't even a face. It was a collection of everything I had ever been afraid of, a merging of my past, my future, and every version of myself that had existed within this loop. It wasn't one face. It was all faces, mine, others, people I had never known, all interwoven into a single, shifting image. I could feel the weight of their gazes, their eyes boring into me, each one holding a silent accusation, a judgment I couldn't escape. And in that moment I understood. The tunnel didn't just rewind time. It trapped me in it. The figure, the shadows, the memories, they were all part of the same trap. A web of time I had no hope of breaking free from. The whispers began again, louder this time, growing more urgent. They filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides, swirling around me like an inescapable storm. But I didn't flinch. I didn't try to cover my ears. I listened. I had no choice but to listen. The voices were telling me the same thing over and over again, each word like a ripple in the fabric of reality. You are already here. You have always been here. It wasn't just the voices that haunted me. It was the realization. The fact that I had never left. I had never escaped the tunnel. The loop had never been broken. I had always been stuck in this place, caught between the past and the future, forever trapped in the infinite rewind of time. There was no end to this. There was only the waiting. The realization weighed down on me, pressing with a suffocating intensity that threatened to swallow everything in its path. Time wasn't just looping. It wasn't even just repeating. It was reversing, spiraling backward, folding over itself like pages in a book that had been carelessly crumpled and left behind. This place, the tunnel, the shadows, the figure had never been a passage forward. It had always been a reversal, a retreat into something I couldn't understand but could feel deep in my bones. Every step I took, every moment I tried to escape, only pulled me further into the past. I stood still, trying to breathe, but the air felt thicker now, almost tangible, like it could be held in my hands. I felt as though I were suffocating in this suspended moment, as though the past had wrapped around me like a vine, tightening with every passing second. The shadows moved once again, their dark tendrils creeping toward me, but this time I wasn't afraid. There was no point in running. There was nowhere to run to. The figure that had haunted me all this time was no longer a blur. It had become a presence, real, in a way that no object or creature in this tunnel had ever been. It stood before me, silent, unmoving, but its presence was a weight that I could feel in the marrow of my bones. Its face was no longer a shifting mass of fragments. Now it was clear, staring at me with eyes that were hollow, endless, like two black voids that could consume everything I was. In those eyes, I saw something that I had long feared to see, the reflection of myself, not as I was, but as I would be. It was a version of me that had already lived this cycle, already walked this tunnel, already succumbed to the grip of this endless loop. I saw my face, older, worn, but still recognizable, still haunted by the same thoughts, the same fears that had brought me here in the first place. The realization struck me like a thunderclap. This was me. This was my future. This was the inevitable, the truth that had been hiding just out of reach, waiting for me to see. The whispers began again, louder now, their words sharp and clear, like a chant echoing from the depths of the tunnel. You are here, you will always be here. They were not speaking to me. They were speaking through me, repeating the same mantra that had echoed in the background of my mind since the moment I first entered this place. I could feel the pull of it, the gravitational force of this unrelenting cycle, dragging me back toward the beginning. But even as it closed in on me, I understood one thing. I couldn't leave. I had never truly left. This was where I belonged. This was my place, my prison, and there was no escaping it. And then, just as I thought the weight of the truth would crush me entirely, the tunnel shifted again. The walls trembled, the air grew colder, and the figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes never leaving mine. I had no choice but to follow, to step into the same path, to walk back into the past, over and over again, until there was nothing left but the endless echo of footsteps that would never stop. The final step was a quiet one, almost imperceptible. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden revelation, just the slow realization that the end had already come and gone. The tunnel, now completely still, held no more answers, only the weight of what had always been. I stood at its center, a place that wasn't a place, a moment that wasn't a moment. Time itself seemed to slip through my fingers like water, and I could feel its pull, a magnetic force drawing me deeper into the past, into nothingness. I could feel the presence of the figure beside me, as though it had always been there, always walking beside me. every time I tried to escape. It wasn't an entity I could fight, nor a force I could outrun. It was the truth of this loop, the undeniable fact that I was stuck here, not because I hadn't tried to leave, but because this was always where I was meant to be. The endless return, the cycle of time, the backward pull, it was inevitable. The walls of the tunnel, once an oppressive force, now seemed almost indifferent. The shadows that once seemed so alive had quieted, and now they no longer moved. They were simply there, existing in the stillness of the space. The air, heavy with the tension of 1,000 repeated moments, finally felt calm, almost like the silence before a storm. But there was no storm here, no noise, just the quiet that fills the void when time stops. In the distance, I could see the faintest flicker of light. It was a soft, distant glow, pulsing faintly, like the last remnants of a dream fading away. It was not a sign of escape, nor a new beginning. It was simply the final marker of the cycle. This light was the point where everything began and where everything ended. It was the beginning of the first loop, and it would continue endlessly, whether I remained here or not. I was part of it now. The whispers no longer filled the air. The tunnel had silenced them, just as it had silenced me. I no longer felt the need to resist, to fight against what was. There was peace in that silence, a strange sort of acceptance that settled over me. I wasn't lost anymore. I had become the tunnel, the loop, the very thing that had held me in its grasp. The figure standing just behind me seemed to nod, as though acknowledging my understanding. It no longer seemed menacing or even strange. It was a part of this place, as much a part of me as the air that I breathed. In the end, it wasn't a creature or an entity at all. It was just time. Time that rewound, time that looped, time that moved forward and backward all at once. It was everything and nothing, and I was a reflection of that, forever caught in its cycle. As the light flickered once more, a final whisper echoed, a soft murmur that felt like it was meant for only me. You are already here. The loop closed around me, and the cycle began again. The end.